Clara's voice carries the weight of the story. She speaks with the authority of someone who understands the stakes: freezing families, desperate measures, problems that can kill. Her humor, when it comes, is the dry acknowledgement of frontier absurdity. Men trying impossible things because the alternative is failure. On the northern edge of the Dakota Territory, in the winter of 1893, there was a cabin that couldn't hold heat. It wasn't unique. Most of the cabins that settlers threw together in that brutal region were poor insulators. Single walls of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and animal fat because they couldn't afford anything better, left gaps the size of a finger in the coldest months. Wind found its way through. Cold had 1,000 entrances. But this particular cabin, Victor's cabin, was becoming impossible to survive in. Victor had built it quickly in the summer of 1892, before the real cold came. He'd been impatient. He wanted his family on the land. They'd arrived from Norway with everything he owned in a single wagon, and he'd constructed the cabin in 6 weeks, using the fastest method he knew: single wall construction, straight logs, rough chinking, a sod roof. It was shelter. It was supposed to be enough. But the construction had been rushed, and the decisions made in haste had compounded into catastrophe. The logs Victor selected weren't well seasoned. He'd taken them fresh from a stand of pine, because properly aged wood would have cost him 2 extra weeks, and he couldn't afford to wait. As those green logs dried throughout the fall and winter, they shrank. The gaps between them widened. The chinking that seemed adequate in September began to crack in October, separated from the logs as they contracted. The sod roof, laid hastily before the first snow, had developed soft spots where the underlying branches had begun to rot. Water seeped through in the autumn rains. Ice formed in those gaps during the freeze-thaw cycles of early winter. The real problem, though, was that the cabin had been built on a site that another settler had abandoned the previous year. Victor had never asked why. There was a foundation, partially completed, clearly half-finished, and Victor had used it, saving himself a week of work. What he'd later understand was that the previous builder had abandoned the site because of groundwater. The land beneath the cabin was wet. It stayed damp nearly year-round, and in winter that moisture rose through the inadequate flooring. The cabin floor was perpetually cold, and that cold radiated upward, making the interior temperature even colder than it should have been. By December, Victor could see the failure in his family's faces. His wife Ingrid was moving slower, her breath shallow, conserving warmth. She'd lost weight, not obviously, but he could feel it when he held her at night. The way her frame had become narrower, more brittle. His youngest daughter Solveig had developed a persistent cough that woke the cabin at night. The single small fireplace in the corner, fed with carefully rationed firewood, heated a radius of maybe 8 feet. Beyond that, the cabin remained a freezer. His son, Fenn, had taken to sleeping in his clothes under every blanket they owned. The children's lips were pale blue in the mornings. Solveig's nose had begun to bleed from the dry, cold air. The single window, a luxury that Victor had paid extra for in St. Paul before departure, was useless. The interior pane frosted over completely every night, and by late December, the frost was so thick that ice crystals were growing inward, spreading across the glass like a map of kingdoms and territories. By January, there was no light coming through that window at all. The cabin existed in perpetual twilight. Ingrid had begun rationing food to reduce the number of times she needed to venture to the small root cellar attached to the cabin's eastern wall. That room was colder than the main cabin. It was supposed to preserve food, but the thermometer Victor had brought from Norway consistently read 45 degrees below zero inside that space. The food was fine. The person retrieving it was in agony. Ingrid's hands had developed chilblains, red and swollen, painful to touch. She'd stopped complaining about them, which was worse than the complaint would have been. Victor had tried everything he could imagine. He'd redone the chinking twice, using a mixture of clay, straw, and animal fat that was supposed to expand in the cold and seal gaps. It didn't. The mixture cracked. More gaps appeared. He'd tried to cover the gaps with cloth and newspaper, but drafts found new roots. The newspaper would peel off within days, torn by the force of the wind pressing against it from outside. He'd closed off the far corner of the cabin and tried to keep his family in, just the space near the fire. But cold radiates up through floors and down through roofs. There's no corner small enough to hide from frontier winter. One morning in early January, when the temperature outside had dropped to a reported -32 degrees, Victor was standing near the fire, warming his hands in the inadequate heat, and he noticed something that would change everything. The outer wall, the one directly exposed to the outside, was warm near the fire. He could feel the heat radiating from the logs at that corner. But as he moved his hand along the interior surface of the wall, the warmth dropped off sharply. 15 feet from the fire, the wall was cold. 30 feet away, in the far corner where Solveig slept, the wall was ice cold. Colder actually than it was outside, cold enough that Victor's breath froze in white clouds when he stood against it. The heat from the fire wasn't reaching it. The wall itself was letting the cold in faster than the fire could warm the cabin's air. He thought about his grandfather's barn in Norway. His grandfather had owned a barn with 2 walls. There was an outer wall, exposed to weather, and an inner wall, and between them, a space maybe 6 inches wide. Victor had spent time in that barn as a child, playing while the animals were out to pasture, and he remembered something his grandfather had said. The space between keeps everything alive. The heat stays inside. The cold stays out. He hadn't thought about that barn in 20 years. He'd come to America and learned to think American, quick, cheap, efficient. Single walls, speed construction, get shelter up, move on. His father had criticized his nostalgia for European building methods, saying that America was a land of efficiency, not sentiment. But standing in that freezing cabin, watching his daughter Solveig shiver under every blanket they owned, listening to her cough, he began to wonder if his grandfather's old barn had known something he'd forgotten. He remembered the barn being warm. He remembered not understanding why the barn was warmer than the house, and his grandfather explaining that the animals generated heat, but also that the walls, both of them, worked together to hold that heat, to trap air between them, to refuse to let the cold come through. What if a cabin could work the same way? He called Eric, the settlement's carpenter. Eric was skeptical from the moment he heard the plan. "You want to build a second wall," Eric said, standing in the cabin, looking at the single-wall logs. "Inside the cabin. 6 inches from the existing wall," Victor said. "That'll take twice the lumber," Eric said. "I know. You'll lose interior space." "Better to lose space than lose my family," Victor said. Eric looked around. He was a practical man. He understood the cold. He'd lived on the frontier for 15 years. He also understood that Victor was desperate, and desperate men make expensive mistakes. But he'd learned not to argue with desperate fathers. "When do we start?" he asked. They started in early January. Victor had salvaged a small stack of logs from a failed claim site 5 miles east. They weren't as well formed as new logs, but they would work. He and Eric and Fenn began the process of selecting logs, moving them into the cabin, positioning them to create a second interior wall, positioned exactly 6 inches from the outer wall, every wall. The entire perimeter of the cabin had to be enclosed. The work took 2 weeks. It was some of the most meticulous construction Victor had ever done. In the haste of the summer, he'd been able to accept gaps and imperfections. But this work demanded precision. They notched the interior logs to fit against the existing structure, but loosely, with that 6-inch gap preserved all the way around. They had to be careful not to damage the chimney, which ran up from the fireplace in the corner. The false wall had to accommodate the chimney's width, leaving that space open. They sealed the gaps between the new wall and the floor, between the new wall and the ceiling, between the new wall and the chimney. Every seal with clay and animal fat and straw, packed tight. By the 10th day of work, Fenn's hands were blistered. By the 12th day, he'd stopped complaining about the cold because he was too focused on the physical work. He was becoming a carpenter alongside his father. He was learning something. The work mattered. Ingrid watched the space inside the cabin grow smaller. She watched the logs accumulate inside her living space. She said nothing until the false wall was nearly complete. Then one evening, as Victor was preparing the final notches, she spoke. "How will the heat from the fire reach this new wall?" she asked. Victor didn't have a good answer. "It will," he said. "How?" she pressed. "The heat from the fire goes up. Your new wall is in the way. Where does it go?" He didn't know yet. He assumed heat would radiate through the logs. Heat moves. That was all he understood at that moment. His eyes went to Solveig, coughing in the corner, and he looked away. "I'll figure it out," he said. The false wall was finished on the evening of January 19th. The interior space of the cabin was now smaller, about 16 feet by 14 feet, instead of 18 by 16. The loss of space was noticeable. The cabin now felt cramped. But now there was a 6-inch gap between the outer wall and this new interior wall, and that gap ran continuously around the entire perimeter of the cabin. It enclosed them inside a smaller space, but protected by this new barrier. Victor built a small fire that night and waited to feel the difference. He waited for hours. Ingrid grew frustrated. "The fire isn't hotter," she said by midnight. "It's just a smaller cabin now. We're still freezing. You've given us less space and no additional warmth." This was a mistake. She was right. The false wall hadn't changed anything. The fire still only heated an 8-foot radius. The cabin, now smaller, felt just as cold because the heat from the fire wasn't moving beyond its immediate reach. The new wall, sealed on all sides, had created a dead space. The 6-inch gap was absolutely still, no air moving, no circulation, just trapped air that was as cold as the outdoors. Victor realized his mistake in the darkness of that night, watching Ingrid wrap Solveig in more blankets, watching Fenn stare at the fire with the exhaustion of a boy who'd worked 2 weeks for nothing. He'd created a barrier, but not a system. He'd built a wall but forgotten the science. The gap had to be opened somewhere. Heat had to flow into it. It couldn't be sealed. That had been his fundamental error. He was thinking like someone trying to keep heat in, but his grandfather's barn had worked differently. The heat in that barn had moved, circulated. It had filled the space deliberately, with intention. His grandfather had understood something about convection that Victor had forgotten. In the morning, he and Eric began opening the system. They carefully removed chinking from the bottom of the false wall near the fireplace, creating an opening about 2 feet wide and 3 inches tall. This would allow warm air from the fire to flow into the gap. Then they opened similar vents near the ceiling on the opposite side of the cabin, giving the air an exit point. Ingrid watched this with visible skepticism. "You're going to let the cold in again," she said. "No," Victor said, with more confidence than he felt. "The heat rises. When the hot air rises from the fire, it'll travel through the gap. It has to go somewhere. The vents will let it keep moving." That night, they lit the fire again. This time, something changed. They could feel air moving. Cool air from the cabin's interior was being drawn toward the fire, pulled into the gap by convection, heated, and then, in theory, It should exit through the ceiling vents and circulate back down through the cabin. But something was wrong. "The draft is making it worse," Eric said, feeling the cold air being pulled past his legs toward the fire opening. "It's creating a chimney effect. Cold air is being sucked in from everywhere." He was right. The gaps at the bottom of the outer wall, the small openings around the windows, the spaces where the sod roof wasn't perfectly sealed, they all became suction points. The attempt to create circulation had created instead a powerful draft that pulled cold directly into the cabin. The cabin was worse than before. Wind seemed to be accelerating through the floor, pulling warmth from around the fire. It was as if Victor had created a wind tunnel and the temperature dropped by 10 degrees within an hour. Solveig began to cry from the cold. Fenn went to sit by his mother, and Ingrid wrapped both children in the same blanket, abandoning any pretense that the system was working. Victor's second attempt had failed spectacularly. Ingrid didn't yell at him this time. That might have been worse. She just looked at him with an expression of such complete disappointment that he couldn't meet her eyes. He'd taken space from her, precious space that was already scarce. He'd taken lumber that could have been other things. He'd taken 2 weeks of his family's cold endurance, their patience, their hope. And he'd given her nothing in return except more drafts. "Close it up," she said quietly. "Go back to how it was. I don't want to see you try any more. Just close it." They sealed the vents that night. The gap remained, but it was closed again. Useless. A monument to Victor's failure, running around the interior of the cabin like an accusation. Victor didn't come to the settlement's evening gathering that week. He didn't want to see Reverend Douglas's careful neutrality or Josiah's barely concealed amusement at the Norwegian's expensive failure. He didn't want to hear the stories already forming, the foolish immigrant who'd wasted timber and effort on a wild idea. He stayed in the cabin and worked on repairs to the roof, small fixes that wouldn't help anything, just to keep his hands occupied. But on the 5th night, Magnus found him. Magnus was from Sweden, younger than Victor by 15 years, and he'd arrived at the settlement only the previous summer. He knocked on the cabin door with purpose, snow still falling outside, and when Victor opened the door, Magnus simply walked in as if he had business there. "My grandfather had a wall like that," Magnus said, once Victor had let him in and shut the door against the wind. 2 walls, a gap between them. In Sweden, where I come from. Victor's exhaustion turned sharp. "It doesn't work." "No," Magnus said, moving closer to the false wall, examining it in the firelight. "It works, but it has to be built right. The gap can't be open to the outside. That's your mistake. It's open to the outside, and the outside air is pouring in through every crack. You created a chimney. The gap can't be a gap to the outside. It has to be completely sealed from the exterior cold. And it has to be sealed at the bottom, too. The whole thing is a loop, closed. Entirely closed." "A closed loop of air," Victor said slowly. "Yes. The fire heats the air inside the gap, at the bottom, near the fire. The hot air rises. It travels the entire way around the cabin, up one wall, across the ceiling. On the far side, it cools and comes down. It returns to the fire from the bottom, from the other side. It's a circle. All the walls get warm because the warm air touches all the walls as it circles. But the cold from outside can't get in because the gap is sealed. Nothing enters or leaves the gap. The same air, the warm air, stays inside, circulating forever, warming everything it touches. Victor understood in that moment what he'd been missing. Not heat moving outward from the fire, heat circulating, a continuous loop, a system, a closed system, an engine powered by the fireplace that would run all winter. "But you said my grandfather's barn had it working," Victor said. "How? How was it sealed?" "The gap had to be absolutely sealed from outside air," Magnus said. every gap, every crack. The only thing moving in that space was the air that was already there, being heated and circulated. It couldn't be a gap to the outside. It had to be a room. A sealed room of air. My grandfather said he spent longer sealing the gaps than he spent building the walls. It took them 3 days to understand the full scope of what needed to change. Victor called in Eric, and Magnus walked them through everything he'd been told, everything he'd seen in the descriptions his grandfather had written. The gap wasn't just an opening to be vented. It was a sealed system. Every exterior crack, every gap between the outer wall and the false wall, every potential entry point for outside air had to be sealed completely. The sod roof had to be sealed. The floor had to be sealed. The opening to the outside near the windows had to be sealed. The only opening, the only one, was at the fire itself, where warm air could enter the loop. "It's like building a lung," Magnus said. "The air breathes in and out from one place, the fire." They began sealing on January 25th, and it was the most tedious work Victor had ever done. More tedious than the initial construction. More tedious than replanting the fields after a failed crop. They used every sealing material they had. Clay mixed with straw, animal fat, pitch, even shredded cloth pressed into gaps and sealed over with clay. The work was slow. Each section had to be done carefully, with Ingrid checking behind them to find places they'd missed. She'd become the quality controller, the one who couldn't tolerate failure this time. "There," she'd say, pointing at a gap a 1/4 inch wide near the floor of the false wall. "And there. You're rushing." They weren't rushing. They were cold. It was February now, deep winter, the coldest part of the season, but the sealing had to be perfect or the system would fail again. Victor's hands became part of the work. His fingers were perpetually cracked, bleeding in places from the rough clay and the cold. The cabin smelled like animal fat and clay. Every wall, interior and exterior, had been examined and sealed. They sealed the exterior gaps from outside the cabin in the morning and the interior gaps in the afternoon. They sealed the ceiling where the false wall met the rafters. They sealed the floor where the false wall met the foundation. They sealed around the chimney 3 times, because every gap had to be perfect. It took them 9 days. 9 days of painstaking work. By the time they finished, Victor's hands were permanently cracked and bleeding. The cabin smelled like animal fat and clay mixed with something else. Hope, maybe, or desperation. Every wall, interior and exterior, had been examined and sealed. Nothing could enter the gap from the outside. Nothing could leave it. On February 3rd, they lit the fire and closed all the seals. For the first hour, nothing changed. Ingrid set Solveig on her knee and wrapped her arms around the girl, and they waited. Fenn brought more wood from the pile outside. Eric had gone back to his own cabin, trusting Victor now, or at least trusting that the Norwegian was committed, but not wanting to be present for another potential failure. The fire burned. The minutes passed. An hour became 2 hours. Then Solveig said, "Papa, the wall is warm." Victor walked to the far wall of the cabin, the wall that was typically cold as ice even as close as the fire burned. He placed his hand on it. It was warm. Not blazing hot, but genuinely warm. The warmth was real and sustained. It was warmth that signified something had fundamentally changed in the physics of the space. "Ingrid," he said, "come." She came, leaving Solveig by the fire. She placed her hand on the wall near the back corner of the cabin, and her eyes widened. "How?" she asked. "The air," Victor said. "It's moving inside the gap. The heat from the fire is warming the air at the bottom, and it's rising, and it's circulating all the way around the cabin, warming the outer wall. The outer wall is warm, and it's warming the interior as it goes." Over the next hour, as they watched, The warmth spread. The wall behind the stove grew warmer. The wall opposite the fire, typically the coldest, grew warm. The back wall, the one that had always been the source of drafts and cold radiating inward, became comfortable to touch. "And it's coming back to the fire?" Ingrid asked. "It's coming back," Victor confirmed. "It's a circle, it doesn't stop. As long as the fire burns, the air keeps moving." That night, they burned half the wood they normally burned, and the cabin was warmer than it had been since the day they arrived, warmer than it had been in months. The children could sleep without all their clothes. Ingrid could work at the table without shivering. The difference was immediate and total. Solveig's cough improved within 2 days. By the end of the first week, Ingrid had stopped shivering. They could feel the difference in her posture, her energy. She was no longer fighting the cold with every muscle. She was warm. But there was a problem that Victor had begun to notice by the second week. The warmth wasn't evenly distributed. The area near the fire was very warm, but as the warm air circulated around the cabin, up the near wall, across the ceiling, down the far wall, and along the floor back to the fire. By the time it completed its circuit, it had cooled significantly. The far wall was warm, but not as warm as the near wall. The circulation was real, but the warm air was dissipating as it traveled, losing its heat to the logs, losing its heat to the cold outside pressing in. "The heat is losing itself," Eric observed when he came by to see the progress. "It touches the walls and cools, and by the time it gets back to the fire, it's not as warm as it should be." "We need more fire," Fen suggested. "No," Victor said. "We need to make it slower. The air is moving through the gap too fast. It needs to stay in contact with the walls longer. It needs to give up its heat to those walls and to the interior cabin as it goes. It's like water in a river. Fast water doesn't dig deep. It just rushes through. But slow water, water that's held in place, water that's given time, that water digs deep." He thought about Magnus's grandfather's barn. He thought about the gap he'd built and how it functioned. And then he thought about a problem in river design he'd once heard discussed at a gathering: the way water moves fast through a straight channel and covers more distance, but moves slow through a winding channel and digs deeper. What if the air in the gap needed to move slower? What if instead of a straight circuit around the cabin, it needed to be forced to take a longer path? What if instead of rising straight up the near wall, it needed to be interrupted, made to travel horizontally, then up, then horizontally again, in a deliberate, interrupted path? "We need baffles," he said. "We need something inside the gap to slow the air down, to force it to change direction, to make it stay in contact with the walls longer." Eric looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What baffles? You mean obstacles?" "Stone shelves," Victor said. "Inside the gap, horizontal shelves. If we position them right, the rising air will hit the shelf, be forced to spread horizontally along that shelf, then rise again when it reaches the edge. It will make the journey longer. Much longer. Slower. The air will stay in contact with the walls more. It'll transfer more heat before it completes the circuit." "That's not a gap anymore," Eric said. "That's a maze." "It's a control system," Victor countered. "Magnus told me his grandfather said the same thing, that the gap needs to be controlled, managed, open with purpose, directed." The next day, they began removing stones from the landscape. Victor had learned where stones were to be found: in the fields, where glaciers had deposited them centuries ago, and in the creek bed to the south, where water had smoothed them over millennia. They selected flat stones about 2 feet wide and 6 inches thick. They were heavy. Each one required 2 men to move. But that's what made them perfect. Stone had thermal mass. It would absorb heat from the circulating air and release it slowly, continuously. The work of moving stones was brutal. Each stone had to be extracted from the frozen ground, dragged, sometimes over distances of 100 yards, and then positioned inside the gap. The gap wasn't wide enough to allow comfortable work. Victor and Eric had to work in cramped positions, placing stones while squatting or lying on their sides. Their hands became raw from the stone. Their muscles ached from the unnatural positions. But they persisted. They positioned the first shelf at about 3 feet up the interior of the cabin's wall, running perpendicular to the gap, spanning the width of the gap but not blocking it entirely. They left about 8 inches of clearance on either side so air could flow around the shelf, a critical detail that Magnus had emphasized. The shelf had to be an obstacle, but not a complete barrier. The second shelf was positioned at about 6 feet, on the opposite side of the cabin, at a slight angle to force the air to spread differently at each height. The third shelf was positioned across the back of the cabin, the farthest wall from the fire. Each shelf forced the warm air rising from the fire to spread out, travel horizontally, and then rise again, like a staircase that the air had to climb. There was a specific logic to the placement. Victor worked with Magnus and Eric to calculate the angles and positions, making sure that no stone was blocking the circulation entirely, but that each stone created a deliberate interruption. The space began to look less like a gap and more like a system, a designed channel for air to follow. The effect was immediate and visible. When they lit the fire that night with the shelves in place, the circulation became visible. The warm air couldn't shoot straight up anymore. It had to hit the first shelf, spread out along that shelf, traveling slowly, its heat soaking into the stone and into the interior cabin through the wooden wall beside the gap. The stone became warm to the touch within an hour. It radiated that heat continuously. The air rose around the edge of the shelf and encountered the second shelf, where it spread again, traveling across the width of that wall, warming the logs thoroughly. As it traveled across the second shelf, the air lost more heat, and by the time it reached the far wall where the third shelf was positioned, the entire cabin was warming uniformly. Within a week, the interior walls of the cabin were uniformly warm. Every wall, every surface, radiated comfortable heat. They'd gone from a single hot zone 8 feet from the fire to a cabin where every surface was usable, livable, warm. The far wall, the one that had been an ice-cold source of drafts and despair, was now comfortable to sleep against. The firewood consumption dropped by half within 2 weeks, then by more than half. They were burning less than they burned in a cabin with 1/8 the exposed wall surface, because the circulating warm air in the gap was delivering heat to every wall continuously and systematically. The system was becoming efficient. It was becoming proof. Ingrid stopped wrapping herself in blankets during the day. She could work at the table in just a single layer of clothing. Solveig's cough disappeared entirely within a week. The persistent cough that had woken the cabin, it simply stopped. Fenn no longer slept in his clothes. The improvement was visible, more than visible, transformative. Victor watched his wife become something other than a person fighting cold. He watched his daughter play without shivering. The change was so complete that it seemed impossible, in retrospect, that they'd been suffering as they had. How quickly comfort made the cold seem like a memory. Clara wants to pause here, because this is where the story changes from personal to community. This is where one family's desperation becomes visible evidence. This is where private suffering becomes public knowledge. On the morning of February 28th, a morning so cold that Petra, Josiah's wife, would later remember it as one of the 3 coldest mornings of the entire winter, a morning when every settler woke in darkness and went immediately to the fire. Something unusual happened. Every cabin in the settlement had smoke rising from its chimney in the darkness before dawn. Every cabin except one. Victor's cabin had no smoke. Petra noticed this because she'd woken cold and was waiting for her husband to bring the fire back to life. She was watching the settlement through the frost-covered window, and she saw it immediately. A gap in the usual pattern of smoke. No smoke from the tall Norwegian's cabin. She'd watched that cabin for weeks, watching for signs of failure or success. Now, no smoke. "Josiah," she said. Josiah came to the window. He was a competitor by nature. He'd been skeptical of Victor's false wall, had dismissed it as foolish expense. But he was also a practical man, and a man who'd been following the story carefully. He'd watched the false wall go up. He'd heard the rumors of the first failure. He'd observed Victor's despair, and then his return to work. "No smoke," Josiah said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "He's burned out the fire," Petra said. "Or he's dead," Josiah said. "Or the cabin's burning." They weren't the only ones. By the time the sun came up, half the settlement was aware. The absence of smoke had become a presence, an impossible fact that demanded explanation. Some assumed Victor and his family were dead, frozen in the night. The false wall had failed catastrophically. They'd sealed themselves into a freezing tomb. Others assumed the cabin had burned in the night, and the remaining coals were smoldering, producing no visible smoke. By mid-morning, a small group of settlers, including Reverend Douglas and Josiah, had walked across the snow to Victor's place. The journey took 30 minutes in the brutal cold. The snow came up to their knees. The wind cut at their faces. These were men accustomed to winter, and even they found the walk difficult. Victor himself answered the door, and he was clearly alive. More than alive. He was warm. His face wasn't the grayish color it had been for the past 3 months. His expression was calm. His body was moving freely, without the slow, conserving movements of someone perpetually cold. "We have no smoke," Reverend Douglas said, as if stating a fact, as if this required explanation. "We don't need much," Victor said. "Come inside." The interior of the cabin was warm, genuinely, completely warm. The temperature differential between the outside and inside was so dramatic that the visitor's breath stopped fogging immediately as they closed the door. The warmth enveloped them. Ingrid was working at a table without extra layers. She was wearing a single dress and an apron. She was sewing, and her hands were moving with ease without the stiffness of cold. The children were playing near a fire that was clearly much smaller than the fires burning in every other cabin in the settlement. There was no sense of cold, no visible breath, no shivering, no huddling. The cabin was simply warm. "How?" Josiah asked, looking around. He could see the false wall, the sealed gap. He could see, but he didn't understand. The wall was obvious. The system was hidden. Victor took them to the far wall, the wall farthest from the fire. "Put your hand here," he said. They did. The wall was warm. "The air is moving in a circle," Victor explained, "in the gap between the walls. The fire heats the air at the bottom. The hot air rises, but I've put stone shelves inside the gap to make it travel slowly, horizontally, vertically, around and around. The warm air never escapes. It stays inside the walls, heating them, and the walls heat the cabin. Every surface gets warm. Nothing stays cold." "How much wood does it use?" Reverend Douglas asked, the practical question. "Half what we burned before," Victor said. "Maybe less." "Look." He pointed to the small pile of remaining firewood. "This is what I've burned this month. In any other cabin, this would be a single night's fire." "And it stays warm?" Josiah asked. "All night? All night. All day. The warmth is constant. The system doesn't stop. As long as there's a fire, the circulation continues." By that afternoon, every settler in the community had visited the cabin. They came in small groups, all wanting to see, all wanting to understand. They put their hands on the far wall and felt the impossible warmth. They watched the small fire burning and tried to reconcile it with the heat in the cabin. Word spread. By the next week, 2 other settlers had begun the work of building false walls. By spring, when the cold broke, 4 cabins in the settlement had the system installed, and another 6 families were planning to add it during the following winter. But the adoption wasn't automatic. Some settlers didn't understand. Some were skeptical. Some tried to copy Victor's system without the level of sealing he'd insisted on, and their systems failed. Their gaps weren't sealed properly, and they got cold air flowing in, creating drafts rather than circulation. They came to Victor frustrated, and he walked them through the work again, emphasizing the tedium, the necessity of sealing every gap, the importance of the stone shelves. One settler named Oscar tried to build the false wall using only wood shelves. He had a pile of wood scraps and didn't want to spend the labor to find and move stones. The result was that the wood began to char near the fire opening. The system generated too much localized heat. Victor examined the damaged wood carefully, running his finger over the scorch marks. "The stone holds the heat," Victor told Oscar, showing him the blackened areas. "The wood catches fire if the heat gets too concentrated. You need material that won't burn, material that will absorb the heat and hold it, then release it slowly. This is the thing Magnus told me about. Thermal mass. The stone doesn't burn. It just gets hot, and it stays hot, and it gives that heat to the air slowly." Oscar looked defeated. "I don't have time to find stones. The winter will come again." "Then we find them now," Victor said. "Come. I know where they are. We'll bring Eric. 2 days of work, and you'll have what you need." Oscar spent 2 weeks finding stones, flat ones for shelves, irregular ones for ballast, heavy pieces to anchor the system. By autumn, his false wall was built. By the next winter, his family reported that they were burning 1/3 of what they'd burned the previous year. Another settler named Jacob sealed his gap too completely. He didn't leave proper clearance around the stone shelves, and the air couldn't flow correctly. The circulation became turbulent, and the warmth wasn't distributed evenly. His far wall stayed cold, while the near wall was almost too hot to touch. His wife complained of headaches from the uneven temperature, the way the cold from the far side seemed to press at her when she was trying to sleep. Victor visited the cabin one afternoon and understood immediately. He had Jacob remove the chinking around the shelves, creating wider openings for the air to flow around them. "You sealed it too tight," Victor said, working the clay away from around the first shelf. "The air needs to flow around the obstacles. It's like water in a river. If you dam it too much, the water backs up and floods. But if you leave the flow open, the water finds its path." Jacob helped him reposition the shelves slightly, widening the clearances from what Jacob had done to almost 6 inches on each side. When they lit the fire that evening and the system began to work, Jacob's wife said the difference was immediate. The warmth began to distribute evenly. Her headaches stopped. A younger settler named Per sealed the gaps meticulously. He was proud of his work, showed Victor each section he'd completed. But when they lit the fire, nothing happened. The cabin remained cold. The gap was perfect, but nothing was moving. "Where's the opening?" Victor asked. "Where does the air come from?" Per looked confused. "What do you mean?" "The gap is sealed." "Yes, the gap is sealed," Victor said. "But the fire needs to breathe. The air needs to enter the gap somewhere. It needs to exit somewhere. You've sealed everything. There's nowhere for the air to go." They opened the system near the fireplace that evening, creating an opening about 2 feet wide at the base, where the fire was. That was the only opening. Per hadn't understood that the system needed to communicate with the fire. He'd built a perfect seal with no way for the warm air to enter it. Once they created that opening, the system began to work. Within hours, the warmth started to circulate. Per realized his error immediately. "If I seal it completely, the air has nowhere to come from," he said. "Exactly," Victor said. "The fire is the lung. Everything else is sealed. The air can only breathe through the fire. It takes in heat there. It releases heat everywhere else. But if there's nowhere to take in heat, there's nothing." By the spring of 1894, Victor had become an informal advisor to a half-dozen families. He understood the system better than anyone because he'd been forced to learn it through failure. He understood every way it could fail, which meant he could fix it. When families suffered through winters in inadequate structures, Victor and Eric would help them plan and execute their own false wall installations. Reverend Douglas observed this process with interest. One evening, he came to Victor's cabin specifically to talk. "You've become a teacher," Reverend Douglas said, sitting by the fire, "without meaning to." "I've become someone who understands a system," Victor replied, "because I built it 3 times before it worked." "You know," Reverend Douglas said, "when I first heard about your false wall, I thought it was foolish. Expensive waste. I was wrong. You've taken something, a principle that was nearly forgotten, and made it work on this frontier. You've done something important." Victor didn't respond. He was uncomfortable with praise. But Reverend Douglas continued. "The principle isn't new," Victor said finally. "My grandfather knew it. Your grandfather probably knew it, depending on where your family comes from. It's only new here because we were in a hurry. We forgot things that our ancestors knew. But you remembered," Reverend Douglas said, "and you had the courage to try even after you failed. That's rare." Clara wants to pause here because this is an important moment. What's happening in 1894 is that a system, a physical principle, is moving from one family to a community. This happens in every technological advancement. Someone develops something. Others try to copy it. They fail because they don't understand the underlying physics. The original developer has to become a teacher. The knowledge has to be explained, refined, transferred. In our modern world, this happens in weeks through YouTube videos and Reddit forums. In 1894 on the Dakota frontier, it happened through visits, conversations, hands-on work in cabins in the winter. But the principle is the same. Knowledge spreads when someone understands how to build something, and more importantly, why it works the way it does. Victor understood the why, he understood convection, he understood thermal mass, he understood circulation, he understood what happens when air moves too fast, and what happens when it doesn't move at all. This understanding, the understanding of the physics underneath the construction, is what made him valuable to the community. Josiah himself had watched his own firewood consumption carefully that last month of winter, and he'd done the mathematics. Victor's cabin had used wood worth about $8 for the winter's severe cold. His own cabin, built with conventional methods, had required roughly $18 worth of wood for the same period. For less than $50 in labor and salvaged logs, Victor had reduced his heating costs by more than half. The investment paid for itself in a single winter. More than that, there was the immeasurable cost of warmth, the cost of not suffering, the cost of his wife being able to move freely, the cost of his children not being sick. Josiah began to understand that the false wall wasn't just an economic calculation. It was a quality of life transformation. By the fall of 1894, Josiah began building his own false wall. This is where Clara's voice becomes decisive. Because what Victor had built wasn't just a solution to his family's immediate problem. It was a demonstration of a principle that would persist for over a century. That a sealed air gap, properly managed, could function as an insulation system that worked passively, requiring no external input, no new technology, no materials that settlers couldn't source themselves. In 1890, Scandinavian and Northern European builders already understood this principle. Double wall construction was documented in log buildings throughout Norway, Sweden, and Finland. But it was rare in frontier America because it required twice the lumber and twice the labor. Victor's innovation wasn't the discovery of the principle, it was the understanding that you didn't need to build the walls simultaneously. You could build them sequentially. You could retrofit an existing single-wall structure with an interior false wall, creating the same effect without starting from zero. This understanding, the knowledge that an existing structure could be improved, retrofitted, saved, was nearly as important as the technical principle itself. It meant that settlers didn't have to abandon their cabins and start over. It meant that failure wasn't final. This is what historians often miss when they talk about frontier innovation. It's rarely completely original. It's usually the adaptation of an old principle to new constraints. It's usually desperation meeting memory. It's usually someone old enough to remember a previous way of building, remembering it just in time. The principle that Victor applied, convection circulation in a sealed gap, is still the basis of passive solar heating design today. It's still taught in architecture schools under the name natural convection or thermosiphon effect. The physics is immutable. Warm air becomes less dense and rises. Cold air sinks. If you create a closed loop where this movement is allowed, the circulation will continue as long as there's a heat source. The beauty of Victor's system was that he didn't need to understand the name of the phenomenon. He just needed to understand the behavior. Hot air rises. Cold air falls. If you seal a space and let this happen, the entire space will warm up. Modern cavity wall construction in Europe, and increasingly in North America, is built on exactly this principle: an exterior wall, an insulating gap, an interior wall. The gap still creates a buffer against heat loss. The principle hasn't changed in 130 years. What's changed is the understanding and refinement of it. Modern architects can calculate convection patterns using computers. They can predict heat flow with precision. Victor had to learn it by trial and error, by watching smoke curl around obstacles, by feeling walls with his hand to understand where warmth was going. What's also changed is the technology to make it more efficient. Modern insulation materials fill that gap, dramatically improving the R value, a measure of thermal resistance that didn't even exist in Victor's time. Modern windows and doors are sealed far better than anything Victor could have achieved with clay and animal fat. Modern heating systems amplify passive methods, but the fundamental physics remains. A sealed air gap, properly designed, can reduce heat loss significantly because heat simply cannot pass through air the way it passes through solid material. Air is nearly the perfect insulator as long as you stop the air from moving. Once you stop the circulation by sealing the air in place, heat has nowhere to escape. Victor's stone shelves were the equivalent of what modern builders call baffles. They're still used in modern insulation systems. They force air to move slowly, deliberately, losing its thermal energy as it travels. The only real difference is that Victor's shelves were literal stones, while modern baffles are usually built into the structure of foam or fiberglass insulation. The principle is identical. Force the heat to travel slowly. Make it stay in contact with the surfaces you want to warm. Don't let it pass through unused. The specifics of how you do that have changed, but the principle is immutable. There's another layer to this that Clara wants to emphasize. Victor's false wall represents something that modern passive house design rediscovered in the 1970s after nearly a century of forgetting it. The idea that you could heat a large structure with a single, modest heat source, if you managed air circulation properly. That air itself could be an insulating medium. That most heat loss in buildings comes from air leakage and poor circulation management, not from the walls themselves. When builders started testing this scientifically in the 1970s, they called it revolutionary. But Victor had figured it out in 1894 by memory and observation. The knowledge had been lost and had to be rediscovered. In the years that followed, settlers throughout the Dakota Territory and into Montana adopted versions of Victor's system. Some used wood shelves instead of stone, though Victor always cautioned that wood could char if the heat got too concentrated. Some created more sophisticated routing systems with dedicated channels for warm air to follow. Some combined the false wall with better chinking materials as they became available. Some experimented with different numbers of shelves, different placements. But the core system, a sealed gap with internal baffles to manage convection, became a standard winter survival technique. By 1895, 6 cabins had been retrofitted. By 1898, that number had grown to 13. By 1900, nearly 30 cabins in the region used some version of his system. By 1910, the number had grown beyond anything Victor himself tracked. The technique had become common knowledge, spread through word of mouth, and demonstrated through visible success. Settlers who traveled between settlements would stop at Victor's cabin and ask him detailed questions about his system. He became a destination. People came specifically to see what he'd built. The false wall never became the primary construction method for new cabins, the way it might have in a region with even worse winters. Lumber was expensive, and building 2 walls instead of 1 remained a significant investment. A new cabin could be built single-walled for maybe $60. Adding a false wall system would nearly double that cost. But for the desperate settlers living in poorly built single-wall structures, and there were many of them, the false wall became a lifeline. Families who would have suffered through winters adapted the system, rebuilt their interiors, and suddenly became comfortable in homes that had been nearly uninhabitable. The economics worked because a false wall cost $50, but saved half the annual firewood cost, which was worth $15 or $20 per year. The investment paid for itself in 3 winters. Victor himself became something of a local expert and advocate. When new settlers arrived in the region, the community would point them to his cabin as an example of what was possible. When families suffered through a winter in inadequate structures, and many did, Victor and Eric would help them plan and execute their own false wall installations. They never charged for the work. Victor understood the desperation. He'd lived it. He understood what it meant to have children who were cold, a wife who was suffering, a problem that seemed unsolvable. He couldn't forget what it felt like to watch his daughter Solveig shiver, to hear her cough, to feel the cold radiating from the walls. By 1900, it was common for settlers to visit Victor and ask him to help them retrofit their cabins. He became, without meaning to, a kind of engineer. He understood convection. He understood sealing. He understood the critical importance of the stone shelves and the precise angles at which they should be positioned. He understood that the gaps around the shelves had to be exactly right, not too tight, not too wide. He could walk a family through the entire process, predict where they would make mistakes, explain the physics in a way that made the work make sense. He would tell them about the river flow metaphor, fast water, slow water. He would show them how to test the circulation using smoke from a small fire, watching the smoke rise and curve and return, understanding that the warmth traveled the same path. By 1905, Victor had helped retrofit more than 50 cabins. He'd trained Eric so thoroughly that Eric could manage installations without Victor's constant oversight. Other settlers who'd successfully installed the system began to help their neighbors install it. The knowledge had transformed from secret to spread from Victor's hands to a dozen other hands, each of them understanding the physics, able to teach it to others. In 1912, a traveling journalist came through the settlement and spent a week interviewing Victor and observing the false wall system. The resulting article in a regional newspaper described Victor's work in detail: the sealed gap, the stone shelves, the convection circulation. The article was reprinted in 2 other publications. Victor received letters from settlers in Wyoming, Nebraska, and even Colorado, asking him for advice on retrofitting their own cabins. He never claimed to be an inventor or an engineer. He just answered their letters, explained the principles, and told them to adapt the system to their own situations and materials. He never became wealthy. He never claimed credit for inventing anything. He was just a Norwegian carpenter who'd remembered something his grandfather had built, who'd been desperate enough to try it, who'd failed twice before succeeding, and who'd been willing to keep working until it was right. He never patented the idea. He never tried to build a business around it. He just lived in his warm cabin and helped people when they asked for help. By the time Victor died in 1927, at the age of 72, nearly 200 cabins in the region used some version of his false wall system. That represents families, at least 1,000 people, probably more, who experienced winter in comfort instead of misery. Children who didn't cough through the season, women who didn't lose function in their hands from chilblains, men who could work in their cabins without constant cold fighting them. But this is the story that matters, not because it's dramatic, it's not. Not because it's about a revolutionary new technology, it's not. It's about a man who understood a physical principle, who understood that his family was cold, and who was willing to spend weeks sealing gaps and positioning stones to create a circulation system that would keep them alive. It's about a man who failed twice and kept trying, who listened to his wife's disappointment and didn't give up, who remembered his grandfather's barn and had the courage to believe that memory might be more valuable than the frontier's demand for speed and efficiency. It's about how a 6-inch gap, properly designed, properly sealed, and properly managed, can transform a frozen cabin into a home. How warm air, given a deliberate path, will travel that path for months, heating every surface it touches, asking nothing but the initial effort to create the system. How desperation and memory and persistent labor can solve a problem that seemed, in the beginning, entirely unsolvable. It's about the fact that, on a morning so cold that neighbors assumed a family must be dead, that family was instead warm enough to let their fire burn low, to stop producing smoke, to sit at a table and work without shivering, to be together without suffering, to be home in a way that had seemed impossible just weeks before, and how the solution that saved them would persist, would be adopted, would be refined, and would eventually become a foundation for how we manage heat in buildings today. The specifics change, the materials improve, the engineering becomes more sophisticated, but the principle that Victor learned from a 6-inch gap in a cabin on the Great Plains remains true. The most effective insulation is often the slowest circulation of heat, and the most effective barrier against cold is a sealed space properly designed.